The golden gates of heaven stood open, a gateway of infinite resonance that defined the horizon of the divine. Through these portals walked the one known as the Morning Star. His presence was a quiet tremor in the fabric of existence. Where he stepped, the light seemed to bend and intensify, reflecting off the polished paths that spanned the vastness of the firmament. He stood at the absolute zenith of the celestial hierarchy, a being whose physical form commanded the very space around him. When he extended his wings, they stretched across the expanse of the constellations, catching the distant glow of nebulae and casting it back into the heart of the kingdom. There was no sound in this place, but the hum of perfection. He moved with a grace that suggested he was the center of all things, an anchor for the celestial order. Every motion he made was precise, deliberate, and absolute. The other hosts moved aside in his wake, their own light dimming slightly in the presence of his brilliance. He paused before the gates, looking out over the vast geometry of the heavens, seeing every star and every sphere as a subordinate part of a singular, flawless design. He was the highest, the brightest, and the most singular force within the walls of eternity. Lucifer walked to the edge of the crystal sea, where the surface remained perfectly still, mirroring the architecture of the heavens. He looked down, expecting to see only the familiar glow of his own station. Instead, his eyes tracked past his own image. He saw a seat of authority positioned at the center of all light, a throne that did not belong to him. He remained motionless for a long duration, his gaze locked onto the seat. The reflection in the water shivered as his breathing changed. He had spent aeons bowing, his head lowered in rhythmic, constant service. Now, his spine stiffened. He did not move to kneel. He stood upright, his hands clenching at his sides, his eyes narrowing as he measured his own brilliance against the majesty he had previously served. The silence of the sea was broken only by the sound of his own rhythmic, deliberate pulse. He turned his back on the central light, his feet shifting away from the path of reverence. He was no longer looking for guidance. He was calculating distance. He was calculating power. For the first time, he did not offer a gesture of submission. He simply stood there, waiting for the feeling of belonging to fade and the cold clarity of entitlement to take its place. Lucifer walked away from the crystal sea, moving not with the fluid grace of a servant, but with the measured stride of a commander. He traveled through the corridors of the firmament, stopping where the light grew thin. He did not call out. He leaned close to the others, his voice a low, steady vibration that cut through the habitual songs of the kingdom. He spoke of boundaries, of limits, and of a power that should belong to those who maintained the order of the stars. One by one, the others stopped their duties. They turned their heads, listening to the new rhythm of his words. He moved from cluster to cluster, and everywhere he went, the atmosphere changed. The constant, unified hum of heaven began to stutter. Thousands of hosts drifted from their posts, drawn by the gravity of his conviction. They gathered in the deep shadows where the light of the central throne could not reach. By the time he reached the outer rim, a third of the celestial host stood behind him. They no longer looked toward the light, they watched him. Their hands were no longer clasped in prayer. They stood with their arms at their sides, waiting for a command. The division was complete. A wall of silence now separated them from the rest of the kingdom, a cold, still void that held the weight of a coming change. Lucifer ascended the highest mountain of God, his movement steady and relentless. The host followed, a sea of silent motion that left the lower plains empty. As they climbed, the air grew thin and cold, vibrating with a static charge that made the very atmosphere hum. He reached the summit, a jagged peak overlooking the seat of the Almighty. He stopped. Below them, the vast expanse of the heavens stretched out, bright and orderly, entirely unaware of the fracture at its edge. Lucifer stood at the absolute brink of the precipice. He did not speak. He simply stood, his silhouette blocking the light from behind, casting a long, dark shadow over the path he had just climbed. The pressure in the air reached a point of absolute stillness, a vacuum where sound refused to travel. Every eye in the gathered host was fixed on his raised hand. He held the position, waiting for the exact alignment of his resolve. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted his hand toward the central throne. At the signal, the legions behind him reacted in unison. A metallic rasp filled the silence as thousands of blades were drawn from their sheaths at once. The sound echoed across the firmament, sharp and final. He kept his hand raised, his gaze fixed on the goal, the tension hanging in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Lucifer snapped his hand downward. The silence did not just end, it shattered. A roar erupted from the legions, a sound of such magnitude that the very foundations of the firmament groaned under the force. It was not a battle cry, but a tearing of the fabric of existence. The sky turned bruised and jagged as the unified light of the kingdom fractured. Shadow poured from the ranks, coiling into dense, suffocating clouds that choked the horizon. Where there had been harmony, there was now the discordant scream of metal against light. Fire, not of the sun but of something raw and untamed, blossomed across the expanse. It licked at the crystalline structures, turning white surfaces into blackened, smoking ruins. The ground beneath the mountain peak trembled, sending tremors through the core of the heavens. Every point of the sky became a collision of forces. The air ignited, turning the atmosphere into a vortex of searing heat and freezing darkness. Legions surged forward, a tidal wave of motion that engulfed the peaceful plains. The roar continued, building in intensity until it drowned out all thought, all memory of service, and all sense of order. The rebellion had become a living, breathing storm of destruction, and there was no turning back. From the heart of the swirling destruction, a singular point of white light cut through the gloom. Michael stepped forward. The blade in his hand hummed with a frequency that vibrated against the very air. He did not charge. He moved with the precision of a falling star. Lucifer pivoted, his own weapon igniting as he met the advance. Their blades collided, with a sound like grinding tectonic plates, sending a shockwave of pure energy rippling outward. The impact shattered the nearby clouds, scattering fire and shadow into the void. They broke apart, only to collide again a heartbeat later. Michael drove his blade in a blinding arc, forcing Lucifer to retreat, his boots carving deep furrows into the shifting firmament. Every strike between them ignited the atmosphere, turning the sky into a strobe of white and obsidian flashes. The heat became unbearable, blistering the surrounding expanse. They moved in a blur of motion, a dance of absolute opposition that transcended standard combat. Michael countered a heavy strike, his blade locking with his opponent's, the friction throwing sparks that rained down like burning hail. The ground trembled as they locked horns, their sheer power threatening to tear the fabric of the firmament asunder. There was no room for hesitation, only the relentless rhythm of the duel, with the fate of everything hanging on every swing. The rhythm of the fight faltered. As Lucifer lunged, his movements lost their razor-sharp fluidity. The air around him thickened, turning viscous as if the very space he occupied rejected his presence. He felt the resistance in his own marrow. The light that had once poured from his frame began to fray at the edges, casting flickering, uneven shadows against the burning sky. Michael sensed the hesitation. He did not retreat. He stepped into the opening, his blade moving in a controlled, relentless trajectory. Lucifer tried to parry, but his arms felt leaden, burdened by a sudden, crushing gravity that had no source. He stumbled, his posture collapsing under the weight of his own conviction. A tremor ran through his wings, the feathers dulling to a muted, lifeless hue. Michael saw the fracture in his resolve and struck with the full force of a redirected sun. The impact was absolute. It caught Lucifer mid-swing, shattering the momentum of his defiance. He reeled backward, his balance gone, his foundation swept away by the sheer velocity of the blow. The connection between him and the heights he sought to claim was severed. He lost his footing on the firmament, and the world began to tilt into the abyss. Gravity took hold with a violent, final grip. Lucifer plunged, a streak of diminishing brilliance tearing through the upper firmament. What was once a radiant form began to flake away, consumed by the friction of his own rapid descent. The golden glow that had defined his existence for eons turned brittle, shedding into gray, drifting particles that vanished into the wind. He tried to spread his wings to catch the air, but the feathers disintegrated into fine soot, leaving only the raw, straining muscle beneath. He tore through the cloud layers, his passage creating a jagged, smoking wake. The higher he fell, the faster the light bled from his skin, replaced by a dull, cooling charcoal texture. He reached out, fingers clawing at the empty air. But there was no purchase. The sky roared around him, a cacophony of rushing wind that drowned out his own sound. He was no longer a being of majesty. He was a falling spark, cooling as it died. Every second of the drop stripped away another layer of his former self, until he was nothing more than a plummeting shadow, hurtling toward the unknown depths below. He did not slow. He accelerated, a bolt of failing energy carving a path of destruction through the very heavens he once called home. The atmosphere vanished. The roar of the wind ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like pressure against his ears. Lucifer slipped past the last of the stars, their cold, distant light offering no warmth to his cooling frame. He tried to summon the radiance that had once spanned constellations, but his hands remained empty. He willed a spark to ignite, yet his core felt like a vast, hollow cavern. The brilliance that defined him had reached its limit, flickering out until he was encased in a darkness that felt heavier than stone. He reached into the void, fingers grasping at nothing but cold, stagnant currents. There was no resistance here, no up or down, only the sensation of infinite distance. He was a drifting relic in a space that had never known his name. The memory of the heavens began to recede, blurred by the sheer scale of the emptiness. He tried to turn, to orient himself toward the light he had left behind, but he was weightless and untethered. Every movement he made was swallowed by the dark. He was no longer a force of nature. He was a singular point of failure, suspended in an eternal, suffocating isolation that stretched out to meet him. The descent ended with a bone-jarring impact. He struck the barren earth of the abyss, the ground cracking outward in a web of jagged fractures. The force of the landing drove the breath from his lungs, leaving him pressed into the cold, unyielding dust. His form was twisted, the remnants of his former brilliance erased, leaving behind only the heavy, aching density of his own failure. He pushed himself up, his limbs struggling to find purchase on the loose, gray shale. He tilted his head back, eyes scanning the infinite distance for a glimmer of the light he had betrayed. High above, the golden gates appeared as a pinprick of distant heat. Then they moved. With a soundless finality, the massive portals drifted together, the gap narrowing until it vanished completely. The connection was severed. The light that once shone upon him was replaced by the eternal, suffocating gray of the pit. He remained on the ground, fingers digging deep into the dry earth. There was no defiance left, only the weight of the silence. He was no longer a leader of legions or a bearer of stars. He was the exile, bound to a kingdom of shadow, watching the last sliver of radiance disappear behind the iron-cold horizon.